Hello everyone, this is John and I'm here today to talk about some visualization and imaging techniques that were being invented during 1900 to 1950. This was a really important time as the new technologies that were being developed were completely redefining entire fields altogether. For example, in medicine, we would have the development and a special discipline of radiology. And in the sciences, these imaging techniques would actually advance certain disciplines, but also create new disciplines as well, such as neuroscience. So I'd like to begin by stating that some historians and academics have highlighted what is called the first wave of medical and neuroimaging techniques that were being developed. And on this slide, you could see I've highlighted each of those things that were taking place during this time. For example, in 1895, we have William Röntgen, who discovers the X-ray. And shortly after that, in 1901, is awarded the Nobel Prize for this discovery. And then later, we'd have some other individuals, such as Walter Dandy, who would perfect the techniques that were being developed through the X-ray. So building upon William Röntgen's use of the X-ray, this individual would develop what was called air-ventriculography to later develop Airencephalography in 1919. Because of these quick advancements and amount of work that was being done within such a special field of imaging, we would have in 1925 the first international conference in radiology. From there, we'd have other individuals who would eventually receive Nobel Prizes for their imaging techniques, such as Antonio Monez, who developed cerebral angiography, and then would in 1949 receive a Nobel Prize for these techniques. And I will go into each of these individuals in the next few slides. So of course, the first individual I'm going to begin with is William Röntgen. William Röntgen was a scientist and professor of physics, and it was in 1895 that he would discover the X-ray. Of course, he was not the first scientist to produce X-rays, but he was really one of the first scientists to demonstrate their practical use. He suspected their significance and how their significance could apply to other fields such as medicine. For example, William Renkin would suggest that this is one of the first times that we could see into a human body without having to perform invasive surgery, cut someone open to look to see what's going on. And to demonstrate his first example, on the image on the right is an actual radiograph of a human being's hand. And in particular, this image is of William Röntgen's wife's hand. And you can see here on her finger is her actual ring. Of course, to William Röntgen's wife's amazement and appallment, seeing this image and seeing the bones of her hand, she felt like she was witnessing her own mortality taking place. But of course, William Röntgen would perfect his technique. And in this image here, we actually have an X-ray of a baby rabbit. But really, by 1901, he would receive the Nobel Prize in Physics for his discovery of X-rays. And this was especially important because as William Röntgen first advocated, that this is the first time that these things could be used across disciplines, such as in medicine, to look at what's going on beneath the surface of a structure without having to physically open it up. And of course, many other people and manufacturers saw things this way, and very soon X-ray machines would be manufactured on a large scale. Some of the manufacturers included General Electric and Siemens. And of course, within a few years, pretty much by 1910, X-ray machines would be in worldwide use. For instance, in America, the X-ray machine was reported to be in about 67% of hospitals across America and had their own specific X-ray unit. Now, the next individual I'd like to talk about is Walter Dandy. Walter Dandy was a neurosurgeon at Johns Hopkins Hospital, and what he did was he developed a cranial image technique in a way of perfecting the image given through an X-ray. And the technique he devised was what is called as air-ventriculography. which it's pretty much doing is it's providing a contrast between the cranium and the outside surface of the brain. What this technique would involve is literally Walter Dandy infusing air or literally injecting air into the cranium of a patient, replacing the cerebral spinal fluid in order to create that contrasting image between the brain and the surrounding structure. By introducing air and by replacing the fluid, it created what would be a better image on an X-ray. Not a perfect image, but the idea is in these types of images, they were able to detect any abnormalities to the outside structure of the brain. And in this example here, this is actually an image of a 3-year-old child who had meningitis. But with this contrasting image with air ventriculography, Walter Dandy would be able to detect any inflammation or swelling of the brain. And here, I just wanted to provide some examples of some diagrams that came from Walter Dandy's article in the early 1900s. Here, this type of needle would inject air into the lateral ventricle of the cranium, literally replacing the cerebral spinal fluid with air in order to create that contrasting image. What should be noted is that where William Renkin was talking about X-rays as not being a very invasive procedure, Walter Dandy's procedure was indeed invasive. It was considered to be very painful, and in some cases individuals actually died from the procedure. So eventually he would modify the procedure a year later to include less air in order to make the procedure more safe for the patient. And the next procedure that Walter Dandy would create was known as Airencephalography. This technique, very similar to the previous one, would require air being pumped into the cranium in order to create that contrasting image between the surface of the brain and the surrounding structure. The difference with this procedure was that less air could be pumped into the cranium while still providing that contrasting image that Walter Dandy was seeking to create. How he did this procedure was a little different from the previous one. Instead of injecting air directly into the cranium from the lateral ventricle, he would instead pump air into the spinal column instead. By using less air and from directly penetrating into the cranium, there was less pain experienced with the procedure by patients, and of course less deaths as well. What I'd like to mention about air ventriculography and airencephalography is that these were both important techniques, because what these techniques provided medical practitioners and scientists able to do was, number one, recognize how brain lesions were identifiable with individuals with epilepsy. They were able to actually visually identify abscesses to the brain. And of course, they were able to trace out how diseases like syphilis could manipulate brain structure over time. So the idea here is that if there was any physically noticeable changes to brain structure or to the structure of the brain, that these procedures would be able to identify those things. And the next individual I'd like to talk about is Antonio Manez. And Antonio Manez created a procedure known as cerebral angiography. And where cerebral angiography differs from Walter Dandy's techniques is that Antonio Manez wanted to create a technique that would allow for precise localization of brain abnormalities. And in order to do that, he wanted to create a visualization technique that would literally highlight all the structures of the brain. And that was done by creating a radial plaque substance, which was a sodium iodide solution, injecting it into the veins of a patient and allowing for that solution to circulate throughout their body. After doing this, he would be able to take x-rays where he would be able to get images such as the one on the right, where all the vessels that are in the brain can help trace and provide that whole structure of the brain as a whole. And the idea here, and why Antonio Manez would receive a Nobel Prize for this claim, is that due to this procedure, medical practitioners and scientists were able to get visualize deeper structures of the brain compared to the previous attempts, which were only really visualizing the peripheral structure overall. So it's important to review some of these earlier techniques used for medical and neuroimaging, because thanks to these techniques, we have now built upon more modern techniques that are widely used and available to anyone who may need them. So for example, those techniques may include CAT scans and fMRIs. These have played an important role not in people's everyday lives, but have also helped to further advance medical and scientific fields the same way William Röntgen's discovery of the X-ray did. So it's important to understand how these things built upon each other, because if it wasn't for William Röntgen's discovery of the X-ray, some of these more predominant techniques we have available to us now, like the CAT scan, may not be as widely available as they are to us now. And to further speak about the CAT scan, in America alone, over 80 million people receive a CAT scan for something that needs to be reviewed. What's important about mentioning this thing is that it falls back to William Röntgen's original principles and practicality that he saw with the X-ray. It is thanks to these images that we are able to look inside the human body without having to perform any unnecessary invasive surgery in order to see what is going on. And it is thanks to these techniques that they are widely used in science and research as well. For example, in neuroscience, we can examine brain structures and we can see how they interact with the environment. Is particularly in neuroscience, it's important to understand the relationship between brain and behavior, and whether we can localize specific areas to the brain with specific behaviors that we observe. And of course, with more modern statistics and quantitative methods, we can put these studies across a wide variety of people or subjects, for example, to see what is taking place within the brain. So how have such visualizations shaped our everyday life? Well, for one, thanks to the widespread use of these visualizations, they are readily accessible to anyone who may need them. And of course, falling back to William Röntgen's original principles and practicality of the X-ray, these are hugely convenient and practical for anyone who may need them. No longer does anyone have to receive an unnecessary operation in order to be observed for any ailments. They can receive a CAT scan and walk out the same day. And of course, are there any advantages or disadvantages to how visualizations have shaped our modern life? Of course, there's a lot of advantages to these modern visualization techniques. They have built upon each other. They have become better, more clear, easier to interpret, but at the same time, it is still a growing science. There's a lot of more things we need to learn and to understand, and that's where these things will slowly improve over time as well. Thank you so much for watching this presentation.